So we want to proceed with our C or C++. So we create a new project. As you can see, you go to console application. We select the title of our project. So I've just put the title of the class, today's date, so that we get to be working with some of the elements that we've got. So basically, like we said, we might need to go through a bit of revision for some of the things that we have done. Some of those things include how we actually use certain attributes. So nothing changes from our C, but would still need to at least know what each element does. If you remember in C, we could create a global variable, which would be as follows. We can say int x sorry. Right, so we said int x makes that a global variable. Where we can use it throughout our program. At the same time, we've also worked with functions. So we can create a function which can also be void. And then we have the function name. We can open and close brackets. We put a semicolon. This marks our function. At the same time, we can also say void. We can put num2. We open and close brackets. We can also put a variable. So what this then means is these are global variable types or variable instances, whereby line 4 marks an individual variable which we'll be able to use. Line 5 marks a function variable which we'll also be able to use. Line 6 marks a function variable with an internal variable within it. So this then means if we want to use num2, we then need to have a variable called v. For our num1, we can then be able to use it, but we might not be able to access an individual variable since we don't have it defined there. At the same time, we can be able to use any of these within our main. So x can be equal to 10 because x has already been declared before we started our main function. However, for line 5 and line 6, would also need to specify the contents of the variables. So, for example, we've got num1 and num2, which are our elements. So, like we were explaining, we've got our x, which is on line 4, and then on line 10, we initialize the value for x. At the same time, we've also got our function num1, or rather num without a value, and then we've got num with the number 2 to it, and a variable within that aspect. From line 9, we can also create another variable, which we can call int y, which then becomes a local variable. This becomes global, that becomes local. Okay, but we'd also need to see how this works. So as it stands, it's more of repetition on what we have done before and what we can work with. Uh, if we are to just run this program, we might just need to do the following first. We do our void num, open and close brackets, and we also create another num2, and we need an int. Yeah. Right, so we've got the following. We need to have our program running like that for it to be able, for us to be able to see what it gives us as an output. Right, so the moment we've done that, we have done our code properly. So there's no error so far, but we can be able to see what it gives us. So let's get into adding some more content. We've got our variables, whereby each time that we're working with a function in that particular manner, we then have declared a function before the main function. So what does this mean? This simply means with the function that we've created, we can be able to put values that we would want to see in a particular function. Right? Let's maybe add some code to have our values displayed. The first element would be on line 11. Let's put a C out. We want to get the value of X. We also want to get the value of Y. And then we want to put an end line. So what will this do for us? The moment we put our content or our context in this manner, we are then getting to display what we've initialized as our Y and also what we've initialized as our X. So X has a value, but Y does not have a value. So let's see what happens if we run our program. We are getting 100. I don't know if it's the same with you on your compilers, but we've got a value for X. We've also got a value for Y, which we can safely say our code works. So we now want to be able to use our functions. And to get to use our functions, we need to call each function individually. So we can put num, we open and we close brackets, and then we put a semicolon. So by doing this, we have done what is known as a function call. Our function call helps us in this manner. It just gives us access to whatever our function has. And since our function has no information, we then need to add some information into our function. So, how can we then get that running? Remember, we said we've got a global variable. We can simply get x, initialize x to a value that we want. We put a C out. We then put some text that says the value is, we put our x, put our end line. Like, so after doing that, we can now be able to see, using our global variable x, we initialize our x, and then we can display the value for our x. Whereby, if we run it, we can then get to see that the value is 200. Or the value of our x would be 200. So let us proceed. Let us proceed. And this then takes us to the next function, which is our num2. Would also want to be able to call our num2. So let's put some content in our num2. Our num2, we can then say the following. We can say v is equal to v multiplied by 2, like that. And then we want a cout. Our cout will then give us v equals v end line, like that. So this then becomes our content. What are we saying at this particular instance? We are saying within the function, we want to have a variable called v. And then whatever v is, we want v to be equal to v multiplied by 2. But we have not initialized v. Can we agree there? We have not initialized v, so we want to get what the value of v is. Okay? So before we call our function, we then need to know where we would want this to be displayed. Let's come to our main, which is there. So soon after our num function, let's put a cout. And with our cout, we want to be able to update our user that we want to call function num2. And to do that, we want to be able to initialize our y. And we say our y is equal to 8. And then we want num 2, we open and we close brackets. And then within our num2, we then pass our value for 1. So maybe let's explain what we have just done. We came to our function void num2, whereby we said v is equal to v multiplied by 2, and then we want a cout that gives us v is equal to, and then we get the value for v. We came back to our main function, and then we created line 30, which gives us call function num2, and then we then initialized our value for y, whereby we said y is equal to 8, and then we said our num2 should get the value for y. So before we run it, here's what it's supposed to give us. We are supposed to say when we call our function num2, we then initialize our variable for num2, which is v, by giving it a value that is on variable y, which is our local variable that we are passing to our function num2, and then we want to get a result. So if we say 8 multiplied by 2, what do we get? Right. So if we run our program and we've done it correctly, we should then get our v being equal to 16. So our v is equal to 16. We've done that correctly. The value of our first function is 200, which is fine. And then the first elements that we had, which was x and y, gave us 100, which should also be okay. So that is how we can work with our variables. So with what we have done in calling our num2, we then can call this a function call by value. Okay, so since it's a function call by value, what are we saying? We are simply saying the moment we get to our function num2, we substitute our v and our y, where if v equals to 8, then y is also equal to 8. So it's simply a substitution, and with our substitution, we can then be able to get the same value being passed through the two elements. So that is the use or the purpose of our variables. Let us continue. So let's add a bit more to our content so that we can be able to see how some of these things can be used. We want to be able to then get into slightly more than just variables. We've also looked at our control statements. We've partly looked at our function. So let's get into another project or another program that will help us recreate some of the things that we've done or get something more out of what we have learned so far. So we get to File, New, and then we select a project, select our console application. We click on Next. We want to say Functions, Program. because we just want to build with our functions, but we also want to work with something that is slightly new. So let us, we've seen what our functions can do, or rather we know what our functions can do. Let's say we want to be able to create a function that gives us a menu. So our function name will be a menu. That will be the first element that we want to work with. And then with this menu, we then want to have a various attributes within our menu. And also, we might have more than one function. And the first function would be our menu. So we can say void menu. We open and we close brackets. And then our menu becomes the next element that we add. So we've got void menu, and then we want to put elements within our menu. So with most programs, our menu is always or almost exactly the same. We want to be able to enter certain values. So for our values, we then start with the following. We need to create, we need to edit, we need to update, we need to delete, we also need to close our program. So those are some of the elements that we would add to our menu. So we can say cout, we open our angle brackets, we put our quotations, we open our angle brackets again, put an end line, and then we put a semicolon. So we need about 4 extra elements. Just do a copy paste to be fast. Whereby the first element can be C, and C will create, E will edit, U will update, D will delete, and X will exit. So I'm just gonna maybe just edit this so that it looks a little bit neat. And then this is what we have for our menu. So first thing, we created our void menu on line 4. We got into our int main, we called the menu function. From there, we created our menu, whereby we've got the following for our menu. So far, if we run it, we can be able to see the following output, where C is create, E is edit, U is update, D is delete, X is exit. So we can then be able to actually start our program from that particular context. create, edit, update, delete, and exit. Let us continue. So from there now, we now need to have a set of variables that help us to choose each of these elements. So the best would be to use a variable of type character, whereby we put int and then we select the type of variable we want. So it's not an int, it's a character. And then the variable that we want is O, which makes O our character reference. We put a C in as well. We put our angle brackets, and then we get the value for O, and then we are good to go. From there, we then want to put our option, or we want to get our option. One way of getting our options is by having a control statement. In the last element that we worked with our control statement, we actually left out one control statement that I think would be necessary at this particular point. So we've got a switch case statement whereby we put switch, put the variable we want to switch, and then within that switch, we can then have a case statement which gives us whatever value we want to be able to work with. So we said the first value is our C, and then our C should then give us a create. So for now, we'll simply just put a C out, and then we put some text, and then we put a break. And the next one is it's an E. Edit. The next one is a U, D, and X. Let's copy that. This becomes U. This becomes D. This becomes X. Copy this as it is because it will be uniform everywhere we paste it. So C stands for create, E for our edit, U for our update, D for delete, X for exit. So we'll just start typing our content. Like that. I think with that, we can then be able to see what each element does. So if we run our program, we'll be able to either enter a value and get a result. our main layout sorted. Let's continue. So what we want to do with each of these elements, we want to actually create a function for some of these elements. We'll be able to refer to this function program in more of the things that will be working. So let's work with that and see what we can come up with. So the next function we want to create would be a simple one, and I think will be the fastest because it doesn't require a lot of things. The first function we want to create is a void, and let's call it close program. We'll create a function called void close program. On our X, we want to remove line 34 totally. And we want to copy this and replace our line 34. Then from there, we also want to say outside of this function, we then put void close program. We put our opening and closing brackets. So in our void close program, we want to put the following. We want to put a cout. With our cout, we want to say, do you really want to close the program? End line, and want to cout, would want 0 for yes, and then would want 1 for no. So do you really want to close the program? 0 for yes and 1 for no. We then want to create a variable for this. So we can put int x, and then with our int x, we want to put a cin that gets that value. So we can say cin, we then get our x, and then the moment we get our x, we then want a control statement that gets that value. So we can say if we open brackets, x equals 0, if x equals 1. This is where it gets slightly easier. We want to say the moment our value is equal to 0, it means we want to close program. The moment our value is equal to 1, we want to go back to our main menu. So we can then say menu so that we return to the main menu. And then for our one, let's just try exit. And I'm not sure about this one. Either 1 or 0 should give us an output that we want. So exit is also a function that's pre-built in C, and it also applies to C++. Let's just run it and see if this gives us the result we are hoping for. So we run our program, and then it gives us create, edit, update, delete, and exit. So let's select X, press enter. It then went straight to exit. So there's a problem with our logic somewhere. Void close program. Close program. Do you really want to close program? And we figure out where we had a problem. So we started with our IO stream. We're using namespace standard. We've got our menu. We've got our close program. We've also got our void menu. We've got create up to exit. We also have our case X. At this particular point, I just removed the void that we had there and we left close program, and then everything else remains exactly the same. If we run it, we'll be able to select X. We then select 0 to close our program, and then it ends our program. Also take note that with the output, or the output that we've got there, we can actually be able to see that process returned 1. Okay, and then 1 is what we put in our exit on line 46. So in other words, our return type is actually an output of the system that we are working. So what this then means is we are then trying to understand what each element or each aspect does for our program or for our system. So here is an example of how we can actually work with our content or our context so that we can be able to build and create programs within our C++. Okay. Maybe let's add a bit more and we see how we can be able to work with our code. So the next thing we want to do is we also want to be able to create a function for any one of these elements, right? So our function might not be entirely complete, but it can be an example of what our function is supposed to do. So let's create a create function. We add some of the things, and then we round up our lesson. So we go to line 22. We put create value as our function. And then with our create value, we then come outside of all our functions, and then we put a void create value. And then we want to put whatever it is that we want to put in our create value. So since we do not have an idea of what this program is supposed to do. Let's create something as we proceed so that we can be able to see what value we can add to our function or to our functions. The first thing that we might need to do is put a cout. And then our cout should then have a title. Create new record. So I want to create value, and then our create value wants to create a new record. So with our new record, we want to be able to enter some content. The first element we want to add is the following: cout. We want to enter a registration number. We also want to enter a first name, we also want to enter a last name. Cout, and then maybe the last record would be a class. So I want to enter a registration number, I want to enter a first name, I want to enter a last name, I want to enter a class. Right. So I think at this particular point, we've got an idea of how we can work with our create. And let's just run and see what our create does. Right. Now it's telling us was not defined in this code. What do you think that means? Create value was not defined in this scope. Hmm? So there's a void create value and our create value then gives us our function. Perfect. So if you go to C does not give us anything. I think we need a capital letter C. And then it gives us that outcome.